Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a mountain trail in Yosemite National Park, to the summer of 1981, and to a 14-year-old girl named Stacy Arras. Stacy was on a horseback trip with her father, a 4-day journey through some of the most beautiful country in California, the kind of trip a parent plans for months and remembers for the rest of their life. On the first afternoon, after the group reached camp, Stacy picked up her camera and walked a short distance to photograph a lake. She stepped past a line of trees, the way you might step around a corner, and she was never seen again. The only thing anyone ever found of her was the small plastic cap from the lens of her camera, lying on the ground near the trees. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you. We're also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there. Now, dim the lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Stacy's story deserves to be heard carefully. She was a kid who loved taking pictures, the kind of 14-year-old who carried a camera so she would not miss anything worth keeping. On that trip, the last photographs she ever took are still inside a camera no one has ever found. To understand what happened on that mountain, we have to go back to the beginning. How does a girl disappear in broad daylight within sight of a camp full of people on a clear summer afternoon? Why did one of the largest searches Yosemite has ever mounted turn up nothing but a lens cap? And why, after more than 40 years, is her case still open? Let's start with who Stacy was. Stacy Ann Arras grew up in Saratoga, California, a quiet town tucked into the foothills at the southern. If you have ever driven through that part of the state, you know the feeling of it. Oak trees and low hills, vineyards on the slopes, the air a little warmer and drier than the coast just over the ridge. It is the kind of place where childhoods happen slowly and safely, where the worst thing most parents worry about is a kid staying out too late on a summer evening. It was an ordinary, comfortable place to be young, and Stacy, by every account, was an ordinary, well-loved kid living an ordinary, well-loved life. She was one of several children. Her parents were George and Carol, and Stacy had 2 sisters and a brother. A full house, the kind of family where someone is always coming or going, where the dinner table is loud and the bathroom is always occupied. She was 14 years old in the summer of 1981, which puts her right at that strange and tender age between childhood and whatever comes next. Young enough that her father still thought of her in the most basic way as his little girl. We do not know an enormous amount about Stacy's inner life, and that is worth saying plainly at the start. So much of what gets written about cases like this focuses on the disappearance, on the search, on the theories, that the actual person at the center can start to feel like a placeholder, a name attached to a mystery. But Stacy was a real teenager with a real life, and there are a few things we do know about her that are worth holding on to. The first is that she loved photography. This is not a small detail, and it is not a detail invented to make the story sadder. Stacy carried a camera, an Olympus, the kind of 35mm film camera that a lot of families owned in those years. And she did not just carry it the way some people carry a phone today, half forgotten in a pocket. She used it. She was the kind of person who saw something worth a lake catching the late light, a meadow, a mountain she would probably never see again. When you understand that about her, the events of that final afternoon stop being abstract. A girl who loved taking pictures arrived at one of the most photogenic places in North America, and the first thing she wanted to do was go take pictures. Of course she did. That was who she was. The second thing we know is that she was close enough to her father to want to spend 4 days alone with him in the wilderness. Think about that for a moment. Think about being 14 and choosing, willingly, to go on a multi-day horseback trip with your dad. Not a trip with friends, not a trip you were dragged along on. A trip the two of them planned together. The kind of thing that suggests a genuine bond between a father and a daughter at exactly the age when a lot of fathers and daughters start to drift. George Arras was an experienced outdoorsman. They had hiked together before, and this particular trip into the high country of Yosemite was something the two of them had been looking forward to for a while. There is one more thing, and we should handle it carefully because it has been twisted over the years into things it was never meant to be. Some accounts mention that Stacy, like a lot of teenagers, was going through a difficult stretch. The ordinary turbulence of being 14, some friction at home, some of the usual struggles of that age. A few early news reports took that ordinary detail and stretched it into a theory, and we will talk about that theory later and why it does not hold together. But for now, the only honest way to describe it is this. Stacy was a 14-year-old girl, and being 14 is hard, and there's nothing about that fact that makes what happened to her her own doing. If anything, the trip itself may have been part of how a father and a daughter getting away together into the quiet to reconnect. Now picture the days leading up to it. It is the middle of July in 1981. School is out. The Bay Area is doing what it does in summer. The fog burning off by mid-morning, the hills going gold and brown. Somewhere in the Arras house, there is a duffel bag being packed, hiking boots being found in the back of a closet, a camera being loaded with a fresh roll of film because Stacy would not have left without it. There is the particular excitement of a trip that has been planned for a long time finally arriving. The maps, the list of what to bring, the drive ahead. Have you ever wondered what the last ordinary day of someone's life actually looked like before anyone knew it was the last ordinary day? That is the thing about cases like this. There was just a girl and her father getting ready for a trip they had both been excited about, with absolutely no reason to think it would end the way it did. To understand where they were going, you have to understand the place itself, because the place is part of the story. Yosemite National Park sits in the Sierra Nevada, the long granite spine that runs down the eastern side of California. Most people who visit Yosemite never leave the valley floor. They see the famous walls, El Capitan and Half Dome, the waterfalls, the crowds, the gift shops. They take their own photographs and they drive home. But the valley is a tiny fraction of the park. Yosemite is enormous, well over 1,000 square miles, and the vast majority of it is high country. Granite and meadow and lake, stitched together by a network of trails, much of it above 8,000 feet. Some of it accessible only on foot or on the back of an animal. That high country, not the crowded valley, the back country. And to get a family up into that back country in comfort, the park ran something called the High Sierra Camps. Let's talk about the High Sierra Camps, because they are not what most people picture when they hear the word camping. These were not tents you carried on your back. They were a series of permanent camps run through the park's concessionaire, spaced roughly a day's travel apart along a loop trail through the high country. Each camp had tent cabins with real beds, a dining tent where meals were cooked and served, the basic comforts of a small mountain lodge in some of the most remote terrain in the park. The idea was that you could experience the wilderness without having to be a hardened backpacker to do it. You could ride in on a mule, sleep in a bed, eat a hot dinner, and wake up surrounded by some of the most. The full loop connected 5 of these camps strung together over roughly 50 miles of high Sierra Trail. People booked the trips far in advance. They were popular and they were considered safe, guided, supported, well-traveled. The kind of trip a careful father would feel comfortable bringing his 14-year-old daughter on. That detail matters. George Arras was not taking a reckless gamble with his child's safety. He was taking her on one of the most established, well-run wilderness experiences the National Park Service offered. Families did this trip all the time. They still do. The particular trip Stacy and George joined was a 4-day excursion, guided, with a small group of other travelers and a couple of experienced wilderness guides, including everyone, the guides and the guests. There were around 10 people in the party. Stacy and George. The rest of the group was a mix of other guests, including at least one older couple. The kind of assortment of strangers who find themselves thrown together on a trip like this and become temporary companions for a few days. They would ride together, eat together, sleep in neighboring cabins, and then go their separate ways and probably never see each other again. None of them could have known that they were about to become witnesses in one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the park. The trip began at Tuolumne Meadows, in the high northern part of Yosemite. If the valley is the part of the park everyone knows, Tuolumne is the part the people who really love Yosemite know. A broad, gentle meadow at around 8,600 feet, ringed by granite domes, with the Tuolumne River winding through it. From there, the group set out on the famous John Muir Trail, the long-distance trail that runs the length of the High Sierra, named for the naturalist who did more than anyone to convince America that this landscape was worth saving. Now picture the start of that ride. You are sitting on a mule, which is a strange and humbling thing if you have never done it, an animal far stronger and more sure-footed on rock than you will ever be. The morning air at that elevation is thin and cool and clean, the kind of air that makes flatland visitors a little lightheaded for the first day. The trail climbs and dips through forest and over open granite. The sky is that deep, hard blue you only get at altitude. And somewhere in the line of riders is a 14-year-old girl who loves photography, taking in more beauty in a single morning than most people see in a year. The group stopped along the way at Cathedral Lakes, one of the genuinely a pair of alpine lakes sitting beneath Cathedral Peak, the water so still on a calm day that the mountains double themselves on the surface. They rested there, ate lunch, and you can imagine Stacy with her camera, because how could she not? This was exactly the kind of place she had brought it for. Then they mounted up again and continued on toward their destination for the night, the camp called Sunrise. Sunrise High Sierra Camp sits at 9,400 feet above sea level. It is the highest of the camps on the loop, set against an open alpine meadow with a long view toward the distant peaks of the Sierra Crest, mountains named Florence and Clark standing on the far horizon. The camp had 9 tent cabins and could hold around 34 guests at a time. It is a beautiful, lonely place. Up that high, the trees thin out and the granite takes over. Great pale sheets and domes of it, polished smooth by glaciers. The light up there does something to the landscape in the late afternoon, going soft and golden across the stone. A photographer's light. The kind of light a girl with a camera would not want to waste. The group arrived at sunrise in the afternoon, sometime around 3 o'clock, after a long day in the saddle. They had ridden for hours and climbed thousands of feet. Everyone was tired and dusty and ready to settle in. They tied up the animals, and the guests went to their cabins to clean up and rest before dinner. Stacy and her father had a cabin together, and this is where the last few hours of the part of the story we can actually follow begin to unfold. To be fair to everyone involved, nothing about that afternoon was unusual. Nothing felt wrong. It was the ordinary end of an ordinary, wonderful day in the mountains. A group of tired travelers washing off the trail dust. A 14-year-old girl in one of the most beautiful places she had ever been, with a camera and a few hours of good light left before dark. Everything that was about to happen would happen against that backdrop of complete and total normalcy. That is the part that has haunted people for 40 years. Not that something obviously dangerous occurred, but that nothing did right up until the moment it did. Let's talk about that last hour. By the time the group reached sunrise, the hard part of the day was behind them. The riding was done. What was left was the easy part, the part you look forward to. A wash, a rest, a meal, a night under more stars than most people ever see. Stacy went into the cabin she was sharing with her father, and she cleaned up. She showered, and she changed out of her riding clothes into something fresh. Ordinary things. The things anyone does at the end of a long, dusty day outdoors. We know what she was thinking, more or less, because she told her father she wanted to go take some pictures. There was a spot nearby, a point with a view, down toward the lakes, and she wanted to walk out to it while the light was still good. To a 14-year-old photographer standing at 9,400 feet in the golden hour, that is not a strange impulse. That is the entire reason you bring a camera to a place like this. She asked her dad if he wanted to come along. George said no. He had just spent the better part of a day on the back of a mule, and he was tired, and he wanted to rest. There's nothing remarkable about that decision, and yet it is the kind of decision that a parent can spend the rest of their life turning over in their mind. He did not go with her, but before she left, he did something that tells you exactly what kind of father Stacy, by some accounts, had changed into sandals or flip-flops, the comfortable thing to put on after a long day in boots, and George told her to change. The terrain out there was granite and uneven ground, no place for open shoes, and he wanted her in something sturdier. Here we hit one of the small discrepancies that run through this case, and it is worth pausing on because these discrepancies matter. Some accounts say Stacy listened to her father and changed back into her hiking boots before she left. Others suggest she may have set off in the lighter footwear anyway. The official missing person description of what she was last seen wearing lists grey hiking boots, which suggests she did change. We cannot be completely certain. But what is not in dispute is the exchange itself. A father, even at the end of a tiring day, paying close enough attention to his daughter to tell her to put on the right shoes. This was not a man who let his child wander off into danger. Stacy did not set out alone. One of the other members of the group, an older man, a gentleman in his 70s, decided to walk out with her. We do not know exactly how well the Arras family knew this man, but George let his daughter go with him, and that fact tells us something. A father who cared enough to fuss over her shoes would not have sent her off with a stranger he had reason to distrust. Whatever the level of familiarity, there was enough trust there for George to feel comfortable. The two of them, the 14-year-old girl and the man in his 70s, set off together from camp on foot toward the point and the lakes below. Now, here is another of those discrepancies, and it is a bigger one. The simple version of the story, the version that gets repeated most often, says that Stacy walked out to photograph a lake that was visible from the camp, just a short distance away, within sight of everyone. But people who know that terrain well, people who have actually stood at Sunrise High Sierra Camp, have pushed back on that. They point out that there is no lake in plain sight directly from the camp itself. The nearest lakes, the Sunrise Lakes, sit a meaningful distance away, more like 1.5 miles down the trail, over and around the granite. Other accounts split the difference, describing the camp as set above the lakes, with the water down a slope and through the trees, visible from certain points, but not from the cabins. Why does this matter so much? Because the distance Stacy traveled changes everything about what is possible. If she vanished 100 yards from camp in full view, that is one kind of mystery, a deeply strange one. If she walked 1.5 miles down a trail into rugged, broken country before she disappeared, that is a very different situation, with far more room for the truth is probably somewhere in between. And the fact that we cannot pin it down with certainty more than 40 years later is itself part of why this case has never been solved. The basic geography of where a girl was lost is still argued over. What we can reconstruct is this. Stacy and the older man walked out from camp together, down toward the point and the lakes. At some stage, the man grew tired. He had already ridden and hiked that day, and he was a man in his 70s, and he told Stacy he needed to stop and rest. So he sat down. By most accounts, he settled himself on a rock or a boulder, the way you do when your legs have had enough, and he let Stacy continue on ahead toward the water. She wanted her pictures. He needed to sit. Nothing about that is sinister. It is exactly the kind of small, practical moment that happens on every group hike that has ever taken place. And there was a witness to that. One of the trip's guides was nearby working at the corral where the animals were kept, and he saw Stacy too. He reported seeing her standing on a rock a short distance off, by some accounts around 50 yards south of the trail. A girl with a camera out on the granite in the late afternoon light. He was, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, the last person to see Stacy Arras alive. Let that picture sit for a moment, because it is the last clear image we have of her, a 14-year-old girl, freshly showered and changed, in striped shorts and a white blouse and a windbreaker, with grey hiking boots on her feet and an Olympus camera in her hands, standing on a granite rock in the high Sierra, with the long golden light of a July evening coming across the stone, and a lake somewhere ahead of her that she wanted to photograph, an older companion resting on a boulder behind her, a father back at the cabin, resting, expecting his daughter back in time for dinner. The most ordinary scene in the world. Then Stacy walked on, down the slope, toward the tree line that ringed the water. She stepped past the trees, into the place where the rock gives way to the forest at the edge of the lake. And from that moment, the record simply stops. No one saw her again. No one heard a sound, no scream, no call for help, no crash of someone falling, nothing. Have you ever wondered how long it takes for an ordinary moment to turn into an emergency? In Stacy's case, it took only minutes. The older man rested. The guide worked. Time passed, the way it does. A few minutes, then a few more. And at some point, the simple fact of it began to settle in. Stacy had not come back. She had walked down toward the lake to take her pictures, and she had not returned, and she was not answering, and she was not anywhere in sight. Up until now, everything has been gentle and golden and ordinary. A trip, a camp, a girl with a camera. But somewhere down in those trees, in the space of a few minutes on a clear summer evening, something happened to Stacy Arras that no one has ever been able to explain. And the people on that mountain were about to spend the rest of the daylight, and then the dark, and then days and days after that, trying and failing to find any trace of where she had gone. The older man got up from his rock. When Stacy did not reappear, he would later tell investigators that he had spoken to some other hikers he encountered out there, people passing through that stretch of country, and asked them if they had seen a girl. They had not. No one had. It was as if she had stepped behind those trees and walked straight out of them. And here is where you have to imagine George Arras, resting in his cabin, perhaps starting to think about dinner, when someone comes to tell him that his daughter has not come back from her walk. The slow, sick turn of a parent's stomach, the first reasonable thoughts. She lost track of time. She's taking one more picture. She wandered a little farther than she meant to. The reassuring explanations a mind reaches for before it lets itself consider anything worse. He would have gone out to look. Of course he did. He would have called her name across that granite, the sound of it carrying out over the rock and the trees and the water and coming back with nothing. To be fair to everyone on that mountain, they did not waste time. They did not assume she was fine and wait until morning. As the reality set in, the group, the guides, and they spread out across the area in the failing light, calling for her, checking the obvious places, the lake edge, the trail, the rocks, and when the daylight ran out and there was still no sign of her, they did the only thing left to do. They got word out to the park authorities that a 14-year-old girl was missing in the backcountry, and they kept searching into the night. Think about what that night must have been like. The temperature at 9,400 feet drops hard after dark, even in July. The light goes, and the high country becomes a black expanse of rock and forest and water, vast and silent and indifferent. Somewhere out in that dark was Stacy, or some trace of her, and a group of frightened people moved through it with whatever lights they had, calling a girl's name into the cold, listening and hearing only the wind and their own voice. A man who, just a few hours earlier, had been tired enough to skip a short walk, now unable to imagine sleeping, walking the dark mountain, looking for his child. They found nothing that night. When the sun finally came up over the Sierra crest the next morning, Stacy Arras had been missing for the entire night, and there was still not a single sign of where she had gone. And so what began that morning was no longer a group of worried travelers looking for a girl who had wandered off. What began that morning was one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of Yosemite National Park. Let's talk about that search. The official search began the day after Stacy vanished, and once it started, it grew quickly into something enormous. This was not a couple of rangers walking a trail. This became one of the most significant search and rescue efforts the park had ever organized, and the scale of it is worth understanding because at its height, the search involved somewhere between 100 and 150 people. Among them were dozens of trained volunteers from the Mountain Rescue Association, the network of skilled mountain search and rescue teams who get called in for exactly this kind of situation. By some counts, around 67 of these volunteers came in, representing most of the teams from across the region. These were not casual helpers. These were people who knew high mountain terrain, who knew how lost people behave, who knew how to grid out a search area and cover it methodically. Park rangers worked alongside them. The area around Sunrise Lakes was divided up and combed, ridge by ridge, drainage by drainage, boulder field by boulder. At least 3 of them worked the search, and the park's contract helicopter alone logged more than 40 hours in the air, flying patterns over the granite and the meadows and the lakes, low and slow, with spotters scanning every open surface below. From the air, that high country reveals itself in a way it cannot from the ground. The pale sheets of rock, the dark stands of trees, the bright water of the lakes. If Stacy had been lying injured on an open slope, or visible at the edge of a lake, there is a real chance a helicopter would have spotted her. They flew until they were satisfied that the open ground had been covered from above, and they brought in dogs, search dogs, trained to follow human scent across exactly this kind of country. In a great many search cases, the dogs are what break it open. A scent trail leads from the last known point in a clear direction, and suddenly the searchers know. But in Stacy's case, the dogs ran into a wall almost immediately, and the reason why is one of the small, cruel details of this story. The conditions that July were extremely dry and dusty. The ground was parched, the dust hung in the air, and according to reporting at the time, the dogs simply could not pick up a usable scent in those conditions. The one tool that might have pointed the searchers in the right direction was effectively blinded by the weather. The dogs had nothing to follow. Put all of that together and you begin to grasp how much effort went into finding this girl. The numbers that have been attached to the search over the years are staggering for a single missing person. Thousands upon thousands of hours of human effort, by some estimates well over 8,000, a cost running to around $100,000 in 1981 money. The search concentrated on an area of roughly 3 to 5 square miles around Sunrise Lakes, the zone where Stacy could plausibly have traveled on foot in the time she was gone. Every plausible direction she could have walked, every place a girl might fall or shelter or become trapped, all of it was covered and covered again. This is the part that stops people cold. Searches this large usually find something. Even when the outcome is heartbreaking, even when the missing person is not found alive, a search of this intensity over this many days, with this many trained people and dogs and aircraft, almost always turns up some trace. A piece of clothing, a dropped item, a track, a sign of which direction the person went. The terrain narrows the possibilities, the searchers follow the clues, and eventually they find the person, or they find where the person ended up. That, in Stacy's case, all of that effort, all of those people, all of those hours produced exactly one thing: a lens cap. somewhere along the route Stacy had taken, near the trail, just inside the tree line where the open granite gives way to the forest at the edge of the lake. Searchers found the small plastic cap from the lens of her camera, the little cover that snaps over the front of a lens to protect it. That was it. That was the only physical trace of Stacy Arras that the largest search in that part of the park's history ever recovered. There was no camera, no film, no clothing, no footprints leading away from the spot. There were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no signs of a fall, no blood and no body. Just a lens cap lying on the ground near the trees, roughly where she was last headed. Sit with how strange that is. A lens cap is one of anyone who has ever used a camera with a removable lens has dropped a lens cap, set it down and forgotten it, had it pop off and roll away. On its own, a lens cap on the ground proves almost nothing. It could mean she stopped there to take a picture, popped the cap off, and it fell. It could have come off as she moved through the trees. By itself, it is not evidence of anything dramatic, and yet it is also the only thing she left behind, the single object that says, Stacy was here, at this spot, and then she was not anywhere at all. A girl walked into those trees with a camera, and the only piece of her that the world ever saw again was the cap that protected its lens. The search went on for days. The major aerial operations were scaled back around the 20th of July, a few days in, once the searchers were satisfied that the open country had been thoroughly covered from the air, and the ground search continued, then began to wind down around the 22nd, the searchers slowly running out of new places to look, and the official search finally ended on the 26th of July, 1981, a little more than a week after Stacy first walked down toward the lake. They had thrown everything they had at that mountain, and the mountain had given them back a lens cap and nothing else. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be the family at the center of something like that? To stand on a mountain while 150 people search for your child, while helicopters thunder overhead and dogs work the brush and trained volunteers grid out the ground in every direction, and to watch all of that effort day after day slowly produce nothing. There is a particular cruelty to a search, that large failing. But when the Mountain Rescue Association and the helicopters and the dogs and the rangers all come up empty, the family is left with the worst kind of knowledge. Not that no one looked, but that everyone looked as hard as anyone could, and she still was not there. George Arras was on that mountain through all of it. By every account, he did not simply wait at camp. He was part of the search, a father out on the granite looking for his daughter alongside the professionals. And when the official search ended, when the helicopters flew off and the volunteers packed up and went home, his search did not end. It could not. For a parent, there is no day when you are told the search is over and you simply accept it and go back to your life. The official effort had a start date and an end date. George's did not. It is worth stepping back here to acknowledge what the searchers got right, because in a case this frustrating, it is easy to be fair to everyone involved. The response to Stacy's disappearance was fast and serious and large. The group did not wait until morning. The park did not treat it as a kid who would turn up on her own. They mounted, by any standard, a major operation. Quickly, with skilled people and real resources. Whatever went wrong on that mountain, it was not that no one cared or no one tried. They tried about as hard as anyone has ever tried to find a missing person, in that country. That is exactly what makes the result so hard to accept. By the end of July 1981, the official position was simple and devastating. Stacy Arras, age 14, of Saratoga, California, was missing in Yosemite National Park, last seen walking toward a lake near Sunrise High Sierra Camp on the 17th of July, with no trace recovered but a single lens cap. The active search was over. The case, and in the months and years that followed, it would become clear that the case was not just an open, missing person file. It was something stranger and quieter, and in its own way more troubling than that. Because as the search ended and the investigation settled in for the long haul, a set of questions began to take shape that have never gone away. What actually happened in those trees? Why did a search that large find so little? And why, as the years passed, did the full record of this case stay locked away from the public, growing to thousands of pages, treated not as a simple wilderness accident, but as something the authorities were not willing to talk about? Let's talk about the investigation and about the questions that have kept this case alive for more than 40 years. When a search ends without a body, the case does not end. It changes shape. The frantic physical effort of looking gives way to the slower, quieter work of investigation. Interview. The patient attempt to reconstruct from the accounts of the people who were there exactly what happened in the minutes that Stacy was out of sight. And in Stacy's case, that investigative work produced something genuinely unusual, something that has fueled speculation about this case for decades. A very large, mostly sealed file. Over the years, researchers trying to understand what happened to Stacy have requested the National Park Service's records on the case, using the Freedom of Information Act, the law that is supposed to let the public see government documents. And what they have learned from those requests is striking. The case file on Stacy Arras is reportedly enormous. By the Park Service's own response, it runs to more than 2,000 pages. To understand why that number raises eyebrows, you have to understand what a typical missing person file looks like. Most missing person cases generate a relatively thin file. Even substantial ones might run to 100 pages or so. 2,000 pages is not the file of a routine wilderness accident. 2,000 pages is the file of an investigation, a long and detailed one, the kind of record that gets built when authorities are treating a case as something more than a person who simply got lost. And in fact, that is reportedly how the case has been classified, not as a closed accident, but as an open investigation with the hallmarks of a criminal inquiry. Here, we have to be careful and honest, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets spun into things it cannot support. A large file does not prove a crime. An open criminal classification does not mean the authorities know that Stacy was harmed by someone. There are reasons a file might grow large that have nothing to do with a hidden answer. Decades of follow-up, years of the sheer volume of paperwork generated by a search involving 150 people. A case that stays open for 40 years simply accumulates pages, and keeping a case classified as a criminal investigation can be a way of keeping it open and active rather than a statement that a crime is known to have occurred. But even with all those caveats, the questions are real and they are fair. Why does this particular case have a file thousands of pages long? What is in those pages? Why, when researchers have pushed to see the full record, has so much of it stayed sealed? When a partial release finally came, what it contained was by the accounts of those who received it, frustratingly thin. A few photographs of Stacy, some images from the search, material that was largely already public. The bulk of the file, the part that might actually explain something, remained out of reach. The most prominent person to pursue this case, Paulides, is a former police officer who has built a large body of work around unexplained disappearances in national parks and other wild places, under the banner of a series he calls Missing 411. Stacy's case is one of the cornerstones of that work. He has discussed it widely, including in a conversation on one of the largest podcasts in the world, which brought the case to millions of new listeners decades after it happened. Paulides has been sharply critical of the Park Service for not releasing the full file, and he pursued the documents through formal appeals which were unsuccessful. We are going to talk about Paulides' broader theories later, and about why some of his framing deserves real skepticism. But on the narrow point of the file, his basic question is one that a lot of reasonable people share. If this is just a sad story of a girl who fell or got lost in rough country, why the secrecy? Why thousands of pages? There may be perfectly ordinary, even protective answers to those questions. Open investigations are often kept confidential precisely so they can stay viable. Family privacy is a real consideration, but the Park Service has never fully explained it. And into that silence, theories rush. Let's set the file aside for a moment and talk about the physical reality of where Stacy disappeared, because the terrain is at the heart of every honest theory about this case. The country around Sunrise is not gentle. Above 9,000 feet, the High Sierra is a landscape of bare granite, enormous slabs and domes of polished rock, broken by fields of boulders, by stands of trees, by sudden drops and clefts and crevices. Glaciers carved this country, and they left it cracked and folded in ways that are not always visible until you are right on top of them. There are places where the rock splits. There are talus slopes where loose boulders the size of cars are stacked at unstable angles with dark voids beneath them. There is water, cold and deep in places. For a person on a marked trail, in good boots, paying attention, it is manageable country. People hike it every summer. But the moment you step off the trail, the moment you cut across the open granite toward a view or a lake, the danger rises sharply, and it rises in a way that is easy to underestimate. A wrong step on smooth rock that drops away, a boulder field that looks crossable but conceals deep gaps, a crevice you do not see until you are falling into it. And the terrible thing about this kind of terrain is how completely it can hide a person. A body that falls into a crevice or down between boulders or into deep water can be effectively invisible from a few feet away, let alone from a helicopter. Searchers can pass. This is the single most important fact for understanding why the search failed. It was not necessarily that the searchers missed an obvious sign. It is that this specific landscape is uniquely good at swallowing things whole. People who have searched that country will tell you that finding a person who has gone into a crevice or under a talus field is sometimes simply not possible, no matter how many people you send. The mountain keeps its secrets in ways that flat ground never could. And this brings us back to those discrepancies in the record, because they are not just trivia, they genuinely change what is possible. Remember the question of how far Stacy actually went. The official short version says she walked 100 yards or so to a lake in sight of camp. But people who know that ground insist there is no lake in plain view of the camp. that the nearest lakes are away. If the longer distance is closer to the truth, then Stacy was not lost within sight of 100 witnesses. She was alone, off in rugged country, far enough from camp that no one would have seen or heard a fall. That single uncertainty, the distance, is the difference between an impossible mystery and a tragic but explainable accident. Then there is the footwear. Did she change into her hiking boots, as the official clothing description suggests, or set off in lighter shoes, as some accounts hint? On rough granite, that matters. Sandals on smooth, steep rock are an invitation to a slip. If there is any chance she was not properly shod, the odds of a simple, fatal fall go up, and there are smaller inconsistencies threaded all through the public accounts of this case. The exact size and makeup of the group, the precise location of the older man when he sat down, whether the lens cap was found on the trail itself or just inside the trees. None of these on its own is damning, but together they paint a picture of a case where more than 40 years on, even the basic facts are slippery. Part of that is the fog of time and retelling, the way a story drifts as it passes from a news report to an article to a forum post to a video. Part of it, frankly, is that the full official record has never been open, so the public version of events has been pieced together from fragments, and fragments contradict each other. There is one more thread from the investigation that we have to address directly, because it was raised early and it has trailed the case ever since, and because handling it carelessly would be a disservice to Stacy and to her family. Not long after she vanished, a news report quoted park officials floating. The reasoning offered was that she had been going through some family or school difficulties, the ordinary struggles of a teenager, and that perhaps she had simply walked off into the woods on her own, intending to leave. It is worth saying clearly why this theory strains against the facts. Stacy's mother, Carol, pushed back on the framing directly, denying that her daughter had any serious romantic relationship that would explain a sudden flight, and the logistics make little sense. Consider what running away would actually have required. Stacy was at 9,400 feet in remote backcountry, miles from any road, on the first afternoon of a 4-day trip. To run away from there, on foot, with no supplies, in the clothes she had just changed into, would have meant a long and dangerous solo journey through terrain that kills experienced adults. And there is the detail. Just before she left, her father told her to change her shoes, and she appears to have done so. That is not the behavior of a girl executing a secret plan to disappear. That is a daughter listening to her dad, getting ready for a short walk, fully expecting to come back for dinner. A teenager planning to vanish forever does not pause to swap her sandals for hiking boots because her father asked her to. To be fair, in the chaotic first days of a disappearance, investigators have to consider everything, including the possibility that a missing teenager left on her own. That is not cruelty, it is thoroughness. But the runaway idea has never fit the evidence well, and it has caused real pain to a family who knew their daughter and knew she had every intention of coming home. We mention it here not to give it weight, but because it is part of the record, and because it is the kind of theory that deserves to be examined honestly. So where does the investigation leave us? With a girl who walked into a stand of trees on a clear July evening and was gone within minutes. With a search so large, it should have found something. That found a lens cap. With a landscape that can hide a person completely. With a file thousands of pages long that the public has never been allowed to read, and with a set of basic facts so contested that we cannot even say for certain how far she walked or what was on her feet. Every one of those threads pulls in a slightly different direction, and out of them, over the past 4 decades, people have built a whole range of theories about what really happened to Stacy Arras. Some of those theories are grounded and sober. Some of them are not. All of them are attempts to fill a silence that the facts have left wide open. Let's talk about the theories carefully, one at a time. Before we go through the theories, one ground rule. Because it matters, we do not know what happened to Stacy Arras. No one does. Everything that follows is an attempt to reason about possibilities, and not one of these theories has ever been proven. When we weigh them, we are not solving the case. We are just being honest about what the evidence can and cannot support. Some of these ideas are far more plausible than others, and we will say so. But the only fully honest answer to the question of what happened to Stacy is that we still do not know. Let's start with a theory that most experienced searchers consider the most likely, because it is the least dramatic and the most consistent with the facts. Stacy fell or became lost and trapped somewhere in that broken granite country, in a place the search simply could not reach. This is the explanation that fits the terrain. We have talked about what that landscape is like above 9,000 feet. The polished rock that drops away without warning, the boulder, the crevices that can hide a person completely. If Stacy, walking down toward the lake in the fading light, took a wrong step on smooth granite, or slipped at the edge of a drop, or fell into a cleft in the rock, she could have ended up somewhere that 150 searchers and 3 helicopters and a pack of dogs would never find. The dogs, remember, could not work the scent in the dry conditions. The helicopters could only see open ground, and a body wedged in a crevice or down among boulders is precisely the kind of thing that stays invisible to both. Searchers could have walked within a few feet of her and never known. The counter-argument to the full theory is the lack of any sign. No torn clothing snagged on rock, no camera found, only the cap, no scuff marks, no disturbed ground, no blood, nothing that points to a specific spot where she went down. But that absence, a clean fall into a deep crevice, does not necessarily leave a trail of evidence behind it. The person is simply there 1 second and gone the next, down into a place the eye cannot follow. The very cleanness of Stacy's disappearance, the thing that makes it feel so eerie, is also, paradoxically, one of the things that fits an accidental fall in that specific landscape. The mountain did not leave clues because the mountain does not have to. Closely related is the water theory. The Sunrise Lakes were Stacy's destination. She walked toward the trees that ring the water specifically to photograph the lake. High mountain lakes are colder and deeper than they look, the water clear and still and deceptively inviting. If Stacy, getting close to the water for a better shot, slipped on a wet rock at the edge, or stepped onto ground that gave way, or simply lost her footing at the shoreline, cold water that deep can pull a person down and hold them, and a body in a deep alpine lake can be extraordinarily difficult to recover. Searches of mountain lakes are hard, limited by depth and cold and visibility. It is possible that the search never fully cleared the water, and that the answer to where Stacy went has been at the bottom of that lake the entire time. The water theory has the same strength as the fall theory. It requires nothing extraordinary. Just one bad step in a dangerous place by a 14-year-old who was not a wilderness expert and who was focused on her camera rather than her footing. And it fits the single piece of evidence we have. The lens cap, found near the trees at the edge of the water, is exactly where you would expect to find a small dropped object if Stacy had made it to the lakeshore before something went wrong. Now, let's talk about the harder possibility, the one that the thickness of that case file keeps alive, the idea that Stacy did not fall or drown, but was harmed by another person. There are two versions of this, and they deserve to be separated. The first is that someone in Stacy's own group was responsible. The second is that a stranger, someone passing through that country, encountered her in those few unwatched minutes. We have to handle both with real care, because we are talking about real people, most of whom were never accused of anything, and many of whom are surely no longer alive. And because the presumption of innocence is not a courtesy we extend only when it is convenient. Take the group first. The older man who walked out with her has drawn attention over the years simply because he was the last of her companions to be near her. But the evidence cuts against him as a suspect in almost every way. He was a man in his 70s, tired enough that he had to sit down. A guide witnessed him sitting on the rock while Stacy walked on ahead, which means there is an independent account placing him away from her at the crucial moment. And the practical reality is stark. A frail man in his 70s overpowering a healthy 14-year-old and then concealing her so completely that the largest search in the area's history found nothing, all in a matter of minutes, with people nearby and a search beginning almost at once, is close to impossible. The facts we have do not support it, and it would be wrong to let a man's age and proximity stand in for evidence he was never shown to have done anything. By every indication, he was simply a tired older companion who sat down to rest and then spent the rest of his life as a footnote in a tragedy. The broader version of the foul play theory, a stranger in the backcountry, is harder to dismiss outright, but it runs into a wall of logistics. Sunrise is deep in the nearest road was several miles away across difficult country. For a stranger to have abducted Stacy and removed her from the area, they would have had to subdue her silently, with no scream heard, leave no trace at the scene, and then carry or lead her for miles over open granite to a vehicle, all without being seen by the people at the camp, the guide at the corral, or the hikers the older man spoke to, and all in a window of minutes before the alarm went up and the search began. It is not physically impossible, but it requires a great deal to go exactly right for the abductor and exactly wrong for everyone else, and it leaves the same problem as every other theory. It explains the absence of Stacy, but not the absence of any trace of how she was taken. This is where we have to talk about David Paulides and the missing 411 framing, because it has shaped how a huge number of people understand this case, and because it deserves to be treated fairly. Paulides has gathered hundreds of cases of people who vanished in wild places, and he points to a set of recurring features that he says these cases share. People disappearing near water, near boulder fields, in bad weather, scent dogs that cannot track, searches that find nothing or find a single item in a strange place. Stacy's case, with its lake, its granite, its failed dogs, and its lone lens cap, hits several of those notes, which is why he treats it as a cornerstone example. Here is the fair part. Paulides has done real work in documenting cases that the authorities often do not track in any centralized way, and he has given grieving families attention and persistence when official channels went quiet. His criticism of the Park Service's secrecy around Stacy's file is a legitimate criticism, and the pattern he describes, the recurring details, is at least worth noticing, even if only because it might reflect the ordinary physics of how people get lost and die in specific kinds of dangerous terrain. Here is the skeptical part, and it is important. The features Paulides highlights are also exactly what you would expect from ordinary accidents in mountainous, watery, rocky country. People disappear near water because water is dangerous and hides bodies. People disappear near boulder fields because boulder fields are deadly and conceal what falls into them. Dogs fail to track in dry, dusty, windy conditions because that is how scent works. A single small item is sometimes all that is left because that is what happens when someone falls into a place the search cannot reach. The pattern is real, but the most grounded explanation for the pattern is not anything otherworldly. It is that certain landscapes kill people in certain ways. When Paulides or others gesture toward something stranger, toward forces beyond ordinary explanation, they move past what the evidence can carry. And for a case about a real girl and a real grieving family, it is worth being clear that the eerie feeling this case produces is not itself evidence of anything supernatural. It is the feeling of a question with no answer, which is one of the most unsettling feelings there is. We should mention the simpler natural theories too, if only to set them aside. An animal attack, a bear, is sometimes raised, but it does not fit. Yosemite's black bears are a constant presence, but attacks on people are genuinely rare, and a bear attack violent enough to kill and remove a person would almost certainly leave evidence behind, signs of a struggle, blood, remains. There was none. The animal theory does not match the clean nothingness of the scene, and the runaway theory, which we discussed, it cannot be ruled out with total certainty because almost nothing here can, but it strains against everything we know. The remoteness, the lack of supplies, the impossibility of the journey, her mother's denial, and above all that small, human detail of a girl pausing to change her shoes because her father asked her to. People planning to disappear do not do that. So where does that leave us, after all the theories? It leaves us, honestly, with the two quietest and least dramatic of them: a fall into the broken granite or a drowning in the cold lake. Those are the explanations that ask the least of the facts and fit the terrain the best. They are also, in a way, the hardest to accept, because they are so ordinary, and because they offer no villain and no answer, just a beautiful, dangerous landscape and a single fatal moment that no one witnessed. The mind resists that. It wants a reason equal to the size of the loss. Sometimes it just takes someone, cleanly and completely, and keeps them. What none of these theories can do is bring Stacy back, or even tell her family with certainty where she is. And that, in the end, is the part of this story that has never gotten easier with time. Let's talk about what happened to the people Stacy left behind. When the official search ended on the 26th of July, the rest of the world began, slowly, to move on. The volunteers went home to their own lives. The helicopters were needed elsewhere. The news reports, which had followed the search for those tense days, grew shorter and then stopped. For almost everyone, the story of the missing girl in Yosemite faded into the background, the way these stories do, replaced by the next thing and the thing after that. But for one family, there was no moving on, and there never would be. For the Arras family, the 26th, it was the beginning of a different and far longer ordeal. The one that does not make the news. The ordeal of living without an answer. Try, for a moment, to imagine what George and Carol Arras drove home to. They had sent their daughter off on a trip into the mountains, and one of them had come home without her, and the other had been waiting at home for a phone call that brought the worst news a parent can receive, except that it was somehow worse than the worst news, because it was not even final. There was no body to bury, no place to stand and grieve, no certainty of any kind, just a daughter who had walked into a stand of trees and not come out, and a lens cap in an evidence file, and a mountain hundreds of miles away that had closed over her without a sound. There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs to the families of the missing, and people who have not lived it often do not understand it. It is called ambiguous loss. The grief has no shape, because grief is built to attach to an ending, and there is no ending. The family cannot fully mourn, because to mourn feels like giving up, like deciding she is dead when no one has proven it. And so they live suspended, year after year, in a state that is neither hope nor acceptance, but a cruel mixture of both. Every ringing phone might be the call. Every unidentified remains found in the Sierra might be her. The not knowing does not fade with time the way ordinary grief is supposed to. It just becomes the permanent weather of a family's life. About a year after Stacy vanished, a reporter checked back in with the family, and the resulting story carried a title that said everything. The girl's disappearance, it said, still haunted the family a year later. A year of birthdays and holidays with an empty chair. A year of a sister who was there and then was not. Of parents trying to hold the rest of the family together, while a year of George, in particular, refusing to let go. Because that is the other thing we know about George Arras. He did not stop. When the official search ended, his did not. By the accounts that exist, Stacy's father spent years pursuing his daughter's case, chasing leads, pushing for information, returning again and again to the question of what had happened to his girl on that mountain. This is a thread that runs through so many of these stories. The parent who becomes, by necessity, their own investigator, because no one else will keep looking forever, and they cannot do anything else. George had told Stacy to change her shoes. It was the last thing he ever got to do for her as a father. In the ordinary sense, everything he did after all the years of searching and asking was him still trying to do something for his daughter in the only way left to him. Have you ever wondered what it does to a person to search for someone for the rest? It is a question without a comfortable answer. Some families of the missing find a way to build a life alongside the grief, to function, to love the people still with them, while carrying the absence everywhere they go. Some are broken by it in ways that never fully heal. Most do, some of both. What we can say about the Arras family is that they were ordinary, decent people who lost a child in the most disorienting way possible, and who then had to figure out how to keep living in a world that had stopped giving them answers. That they managed to keep going at all is its own kind of quiet strength. Meanwhile, the case itself entered a strange afterlife. It did not get solved, but it also did not get closed. Year after year, decade after decade, Stacy Ann Arras remained officially a missing person, listed by the National Park Service, her name and her photograph kept on the rolls of the missing, alongside her description, the one frozen in 1981. 5'5", 120 pounds, blonde hair, last seen wearing striped shorts and a white blouse and a windbreaker and grey hiking boots, carrying a camera. A description of a 14-year-old girl that will never be updated, because she will be 14 forever in the only record that exists of her. That permanence is its own kind of haunting. Somewhere in the official files, Stacy is still out there, still 14, still walking toward a lake on a July evening. The world moved on by decades. Cameras stopped using film. The High Sierra camps kept running their seasons year after year, families riding in on mules just as the Arras family did, sleeping in those same tent cabins, watching that. And through all of it, the case stayed open. The file kept growing, and the answer stayed exactly where it had been since the first night. Nowhere. It would be comforting to say that over the years, some break came. A confession, a discovery, a set of remains finally surfacing from a crevice or a lake bed, giving the family at least the certainty of an ending. But none of that has happened. More than 40 years on, the case stands almost exactly where it stood in the summer of 1981. Stacy walked into the trees. The lens cap was found. Everything else is silence. What has changed is the attention. In recent years, Stacy's case has found a vast new audience, far larger than through the Missing 411 series, through long discussions on enormously popular podcasts, through countless videos and articles and forum threads. The story of the girl who vanished in Yosemite with only a lens cap left behind has been told and retold to millions of people who are not even alive when it happened. In one sense, that is a good thing. A case this cold needs attention to have any hope of someday being solved. Public interest keeps a name alive, keeps eyes open, keeps the small chance of a break from going to zero. But there is a harder side to that attention, and it is worth naming honestly, because it speaks to how we, all of us, who are drawn for every careful, fact-based account of Stacy's disappearance, there are others that reach for the sensational, that treat a real dead girl as a piece of entertainment, that spin her loss into wild speculation about forces unknown, that strip away the fact that she was a person and leave only the spooky shape of a mystery. Somewhere out there, very likely, are people who knew Stacy. Siblings, cousins, friends who were 14 when she vanished and are now in their late 50s. People for whom this is not a campfire story or a podcast episode, but the worst thing that ever happened to their family. When we talk about Stacy, we owe it to them to remember that. The attention that might one day help solve her case is the same attention that can reopen a family's wound for clicks. The difference is in how we tell it, with care or without. To be fair, the renewed it has kept pressure, however slight, on the question of why the full case file remains sealed. It has reminded the public that the case is unsolved, not forgotten. And it has, for better and worse, ensured that Stacy Arras is not just a name in a dusty file, but a story that people still carry. Whether that story is ever resolved, whether anyone alive will ever learn what happened in those trees, no one can say. The honest answer, the only honest answer, is that the case is still open, and the silence is still complete, and the family, those of them still living, are still waiting. And that waiting, more than the mystery, more than the theories, more than the lens cap, is the true weight of this story. Not the question of what happened, the cost of never knowing. But to really understand how a case like Stacy's can stay open and silent for so long, it helps to understand the place itself and the strange, quiet truth that she is not the only. Yosemite is one of the most beloved places in America, and for good reason. Generations of people have stood in that valley and felt something close to reverence, the sense that they were looking at proof of how beautiful the world can be. But the parts of the park that draw the crowds, the valley floor with its waterfalls and its famous walls, make up only a sliver of what Yosemite actually is. The real Yosemite, by sheer area, is the high country. Hundreds of square miles of granite and forest and lake, much of it far from any road, some of it rarely visited by anyone at all. And that country, for all its beauty, is genuinely wild. It does not care about us. It is not designed for our safety. And over the decades, it has quietly taken people more than most visitors ever realize. Stacy Arras is not the only person to vanish into. Over the years, by the accounting of those who track these things, more than a dozen people have disappeared in the park and were never recovered, walking off into the backcountry or the high trails and simply never coming back. Some were hikers who set out alone and were never seen again. Some were day visitors who wandered off and dissolved into the landscape. Each of those names belongs to a family with their own version of the Arras family's endless waiting. We are not going to turn their losses into a list, because each of them deserves their own careful telling, and because Stacy's story is the one we came here to honor. But it matters to know that she is part of a pattern. The park has a way of keeping some of the people who enter it, and the high country around places like Sunrise is exactly where it tends to happen. Why there? The honest answer comes back to everything we have already talked about, the same brutal physics of granite and water and depth. The High Sierra is a landscape built to hide what falls into it. The crevices, the talus fields, the deep cold lakes, the sheer scale of empty country in every direction. A person who goes down in the wrong place there can become unfindable in an instant, not because of anything mysterious, but because the land itself is a perfect hiding place, and it does not give back what it takes easily. Search and rescue teams who work that country know this better than anyone. They will tell you with a kind of weary honesty that there are places up there where a body could lie undiscovered for 100 years, a few feet from a trail that thousands of people walk every summer. That is the sober reality behind the ear when you hear that a girl vanished within sight of camp and the largest search in the area found only a lens cap. Your mind reaches for something extraordinary because the ordinary explanations feel too small to fit the strangeness. But the people who actually search these mountains are not, for the most part, reaching for the extraordinary. They are thinking about crevices and water and the cruel efficiency with which this specific landscape can erase a person. The mystery of Stacy's case is real, but it may be less a mystery of what kind of force took her, and more a mystery of which exact dangerous spot, out of 1,000 of them, she happened to find in those few unwatched minutes. The High Sierra camps, for their part, kept going. They are still there, still running their seasons when conditions allow. Families still booking the trips far in advance, still riding mules up from Tuolumne Meadows along the John Muir Trail, still stopping at Cathedral Lakes, still arriving at sunrise in the late afternoon to wash off the trail dust and watch the light go gold across the granite. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The exact trip the Arras family took, the exact route, the exact camp, has been repeated thousands of times in the decades since by thousands of ordinary people having the time of their lives, almost none of whom have any idea that a 14-year-old girl once walked away from that very camp toward that very lake and never came back. The mountain keeps no monument to her. The cabins do not remember. The light comes across the rock the same as it always has. There's something both comforting, because it means the place that took Stacy is not cursed, not a site of horror, just a beautiful and occasionally dangerous piece of wilderness where, overwhelmingly, people have wonderful and safe experiences. Unbearable, because it means the world simply closed over her absence and carried on, and the only people who feel the shape of that absence are the ones who loved her. The mountain moved on the very next morning. Her family never could. For people who care about cases like this, the natural question is whether anything can still be done, whether, after 40 years, there's any path to an answer. The honest truth is that the odds grow longer every year. If Stacy fell into a crevice or a lake, modern recovery is still extraordinarily difficult in that terrain, and the chance of a hiker stumbling onto remains after this much time is small, though not zero. People do occasionally find things in the high country decades later, bones brought to the surface by a shifting talus field or a receding shoreline. Every few years, somewhere in the mountains of the West, a decades-old mystery is quietly closed when a backpacker finds what a search missed. It is not impossible that one day someone will find what is left of Stacy and give her family, or whoever of them is still living, the terrible mercy of certainty. And there is the file, those thousands of sealed pages. As long as that record exists and remains closed, there is at least the possibility that it contains something, some detail, some lead, some piece of the investigation that was never made public and that might, in the right hands, point somewhere. The people who have fought to open that file are not chasing a conspiracy so much as chasing the simple hope that the answer might already be written down somewhere, waiting. Whether it is or not, no, but the fight to find out is, in its way, another form of the same refusal that George Arras lived by, the refusal to accept that nothing more can be done. To be fair, the most likely truth is the hardest one. The most likely truth is that there is no hidden answer in those pages, no overlooked clue, no break waiting to happen. The most likely truth is that Stacy Arras took a wrong step in a beautiful and merciless place on a summer evening in 1981, and that the mountain took her cleanly and completely, and that no one will ever know exactly where or how. That is not a satisfying ending. It is barely an ending at all, but it may be the true one. And part of honoring Stacy is being willing to sit with the possibility that her story has no answer, and that the wanting of one is ours, not hers. Which brings us finally back to where we should end, not with the mountain, and not with the mystery, and not with the file or the theories, the girl at the center of all of it, who has been through all these decades of speculation, in danger of being forgotten as a person while being remembered as a case. Let's give the last of our time to her. Here is where the case stands today, stated plainly. More than 40 years after she walked toward a lake near Sunrise High Sierra Camp, Stacy Ann Arras is still officially a missing person. No remains have ever been found. No one has ever been charged. The only physical trace ever recovered is the lens cap from her camera, and the full record of the investigation remains sealed. We do not know what happened to her. We may never know, but behind the case file, behind the sealed pages and the theories and the decades of speculation, was a real person. A 14-year-old girl from Saratoga, California, who loved taking pictures so much that she carried a camera into the mountains and could not wait, even on a tiring first evening. A daughter who chose to spend 4 days alone in the wilderness with her father, which tells you something about the kind of family she came from and the kind of bond they had. A girl whose dad cared enough to tell her to change her shoes and who cared enough to listen. A sister. A kid in the middle of the hard, ordinary work of growing up, who had every reason to believe she was coming back to camp for dinner. She was not a mystery. She was a person, and she deserved a long life full of all the pictures she never got to take. It is worth remembering, too, that the last thing Stacy did, as far as we know, was something hopeful. She did not walk into those trees in fear or in flight. She walked into them chasing beauty, with a camera in her hands toward a lake she wanted to photograph in the best light of the day. Whatever happened next, that was her last intention. To make something lovely out of a beautiful evening. There is a small mercy in that, if you look for it. She was not running from anything. She was walking towards something good. So tonight, as you think about Stacy's story, try to remember her not for how she vanished, but for who she was. Not as the girl in the case file, frozen at 14, but as a person who was loved and who loved her family and who saw the world as something worth photographing. Cases like hers ask something quiet of us. They ask us to pay attention to the people we are with, in the wild and everywhere else, because the line between an ordinary evening and a permanent absence can be as thin as a few minutes and a few steps. They ask us to be a little gentler with the families of the missing, who carry a grief most of us will never have to understand. And they ask us not to let the strangeness of a mystery erase the humanity. Somewhere on that mountain, the light still comes across the granite in the late afternoon, the way it did on the evening Stacy walked out to meet it. The lake is still there, still ringed by the same trees. And whatever the rock and the water have been keeping all these years, they have kept it well. Stacy Arras was 14 years old. She loved to take pictures, and she walked into the trees on a clear summer evening to photograph a lake. Her story is still unfinished, and the mountain that took her has never said a word.